All right, I've got the top of the hour, and we were going to go ahead and start things here. I just want to go over a couple housekeeping items, and then I'll let our presenter introduce herself, and so she can give some background information about her. Just a few housekeeping items. Please mute your phone by pressing *6, and we just do that just to avoid background noise. If you cannot hear us or have trouble understanding, you can unmute your phone by pressing *6 again. Or if you need to ask a question during the presentation, just use the chat feature, which is on the right side of your screen. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to the RBEST website as soon as we can, probably within a week or so. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Sherry Williamson, our presenter today.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us on what I assume is probably at least a portion of your lunch hour. So I really do appreciate this because I think it's certainly a very important topic for us to cover. My name is Sherry Williamson. I've been with the Arkansas Commission on Child Abuse, Rape, and Domestic Violence for almost 12 years, and a big part of my job is providing trainings, and a lot of the trainings that I do are on mandated reporting. A couple of things to let you know about what is not really going to be included in this training. We only have 30 minutes, and I wanted to be able to answer as many of your questions as possible directly related to mandated reporting. So this presentation doesn't actually include any information with regard to what we consider child abuse, what the indicators of child abuse are, how to manage disclosures from children, those types of things. I'll be happy to do another webinar at a later date or talk to each of you individually if you need it, should you have, questions directly related to that. Okay, so with that, and one other thing, I heard somebody ask what is an MPA. It's Masters in Public Administration. So with that having been said, I'm going to go ahead and get started, get through my slides so that hopefully we have time for some questions at the end. Okay, first, I've developed this with a lot of the frequently asked questions, just very basic questions I get when I do trainings on mandated reporting. What is a mandated reporter? A mandated reporter is someone who's legally required to report abuse or suspected abuse of a child. Kind of a myth that surrounds mandated reporting is that we actually even get phone calls from people asking what do they need to do to get certified to be a mandated reporter, if there's some sort of class they need to take. And it's basically just actually determined by your profession, whether or not you're a mandated reporter. There's a list of mandated reporters in the Child Maltreatment Act, and at this point I would like to bring your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of your slide. You will notice that there is an Arkansas Code annotation listed in that bottom corner. This is because when I do presentations, I don't like to actually cut and paste parts of the law and put in a presentation, because if you keep a copy of it and the law changes, then even if you have the best intentions, you might be looking at inaccurate information. So that code annotation can actually be plugged in online when you search the Arkansas Code, and it will pull up the entire list for you. I checked it as of yesterday. They still don't have the list updated to include legislative changes from the 2013 legislative session. The only one that was added that I think might be important for you all to know, to let your coworkers know, is that Act 1086 of 2013 added mental health paraprofessional to the list, even though mental health professionals were already on the list. Okay, so how you are determined to be a mandated reporter depends basically on what you do for a living. In most cases, a couple of other things that might fall within would be some volunteers in certain instances working with children, and then also foster parents in the state of Arkansas. Having done it, I can tell you it's definitely a job, even though it's not something considered a job. So they're definitely on the list. And if you happen to look at that list, you'll see that most of the professions, it's very straightforward. It will say teacher, counselor, dentist, dental hygienist. But there are a couple that are kind of catch-all, is what I call them. Like there's one that's listed that says medical personnel who may be engaged in the admission, examination, care, or treatment of persons. So we have to kind of think about how many medical personnel come in contact with a patient who comes in, say, to the ER. So if you think about it that way, that they might be catching some other folks who aren't already on the list. I do think it's interesting that both physicians and surgeons are on the list, because last time I checked, you had to be a physician to become a surgeon, but for some reason they wanted to be listed separately, so I think that's interesting. The other one that is on the list that is a little, there's some question as to a definition, would be school official. Prior to the Penn State scandal, school official was just kind of considered to be the administrators of a school, and now the Department of Human Services has actually promulgated a rule with a definition for school official that it basically covers anyone who could have children left in their care. So if the school secretary, administrative assistant walks down the hall to watch a classroom, then she would be technically a mandated reporter during that, in that situation. Okay, we have a question as to whether or not the PowerPoint will be available for print, because someone would like to have a copy of it, and Chad's saying yes, it will. Absolutely. Thank you for your question.
This is Carrie. I've got a question. I'm trying to get every time I try to log onto the program to see the PowerPoint, it's not allowing me to do that.
Okay, Carrie, if you could just follow along, and I'll email you the PowerPoint to you after the webinar. How does that sound?
That's great. I just want to okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the number one question that I get, even from mandated reporters who know that they are mandated reporters. And the question is, when should mandated reporters actually make a report to the hotline? A lot of people think, do I make a report if I have an actual disclosure from a child? In some situations, yes. But if you have a 4-year-old in front of you with a giant handprint on their face and they're not alleging anything, it's pretty clear that they've been hit. So sometimes it's based on evidence that you see. Sometimes it's based on a disclosure from a child. Sometimes, especially in the mental health profession, you all are trained to observe behavioral indicators that we see from children. So maybe sometimes that would be something that you would report, even though it's very difficult to get a call accepted at the hotline just based on what's going on behaviorally. Okay, but so what the law tells us, and what it has said the entire time, that at least that I have been here, is that mandated reporters shall immediately notify the hotline if they have reasonable cause to suspect that a child has been subjected to maltreatment. So you always have to ask yourself that question. And I get calls every single week from someone in this who wants to give me a scenario and ask if they should call the hotline. And so what I'm getting is their observations, and I don't know all the questions asked by the hotline, so I always say, do you feel that you have reasonable cause to suspect? You only have to have that reasonable suspicion in order to actually need to call the hotline according to the law. That's something that you always need. If you don't remember anything else from this training, I would say that how important it is to remember what your standard is, what your legal, the legal floor for you, let's say, is calling if you have reasonable cause to suspect. And that's what you're legally required as mandated reporters to do. Okay, how do you make a report? One of the really good things about being a mandated reporter is that since, I believe it was the 2007 legislative session, there has been an option, rather than just calling the hotline and waiting on hold, to actually fax in reports. And there's a specific fax form you have to use for this, and there's a link on your screen where you can go to that mandated reporter, Arkansas Mandated Reporter website, and you can look under the Resources tab, and then maybe it's under Forms. There's a copy of the official form the state police allows people to use. It has the fax number on it and everything that you can use. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. If you report by fax, you cannot report anonymously, okay? So you have to give them your contact information because you're not having a two-way conversation with them. The other thing is you can only report by fax if it's a non-emergency. Okay, so if you have any concern for that child's safety when they leave your office, you don't need to report by fax. And the reason is, if you report by fax, they have so many faxes coming in every day now that it's sometimes hours before someone will get to yours, because as they come off the fax, they go into the bottom of a pile, and they have someone sitting there going through the faxes and reviewing the law to see if they can accept them. If you do send a fax, you will get at some point a confirmation sheet back letting them know that it was either accepted for investigation or it was screened out and not accepted for investigation. In any other situation, you need to pick up the phone and actually call the hotline. The busiest time for the hotline, it starts about 10 a.m. in the morning. It starts getting really busy, and it's my understanding it's until just after school, around 4. So between 10 to 4 are really their highest volume call times. I understand that sometimes you'll be on hold for a while when you call, and they do answer the calls and the orders that come in, so you don't want to get frustrated and hang up and then call back. And just know, I have been in that room where they answer the phone at the state police, and the people who are in there answering the phone have lights blinking in their face, and they know how many calls are on hold and how long they've been on hold. So just know that they're on the other line taking an allegation from someone else. The fax forms seem to have lessened that issue a little bit if they're fully staffed. And that's another good thing about using the fax if it's a non-emergency. So when we have someone trying to call in with a serious emergency, that they're more likely to be able to get through in an expedient manner. Okay, here's another good question. What if my supervisor tries to prevent me from reporting? We actually started making changes to the mandated reporting law in 2007. There was a task force on abused and neglected children that was convened during the interim between the 2005 and 2007 sessions. And this task force looked at child abuse issues and trying to figure out what could we do. And one of the things that they realized was, if we can't stop the parents from abusing the children in the first place, we need to do whatever we can to protect the people who make the reports, to try to make them comfortable enough and willing to make the reports so that the abuse will be stopped as quickly as possible. So one of the changes that we made was that it's actually now written into the law that employers cannot, and at first it said it was just schools, daycares, and Head Start programs, and during the 2013 session they changed it basically to say all employers may not require permission or notification of any person prior to a mandated reporter making a report to the hotline. Okay, you can't be told, you have to come and tell me before you call the hotline. It's against the law. Employers may also not knowingly retaliate against mandated reporters for making a report to the hotline. That is also against the law. And that one has been added more recently, this session or the last one. They're kind of starting to bleed together for me. Let's see here. Okay, I have a question here. I heard there was a recent change where you could no longer, as LACs, LPCs, do anonymous calls. Is that true? Here, this was a recent change. I'm still sifting through all of the legislation that passed this last session. I don't remember that being an issue. And I think that I would remember, but what I can do is check on it. If you will email, you're going to have my email address at the end of the slideshow, and if you will email me separately, I will be happy to check into it and be sure, because I certainly don't want to give you the wrong answer, but I don't remember that being an issue. And okay, I'm sorry. I got a little feedback and thought someone was about to say something. Okay, what if I fail to make a report? This is really important, and it's something that I'm going to be really honest with you. The first several years I worked here, I would stand up in front of groups and talk about civil penalties and criminal penalties, and just know as I was standing there saying it that no one was going to ever do anything to someone who failed to make a report. But as time has gone on, it has become more clear to me that people are starting to get the point that there are large groups of us, myself included, who kind of have this responsibility as frontline people to do what we can to protect children, and if we don't, then we're going to be held accountable for it. I can tell you right now in this state, we have a situation where we had employees who were mandated reporters who were told an allegation. I believe one actually observed something happening, and then one of the others was told an allegation. A third person was brought into the discussion. So we had 3 mandated reporters who knew what the allegation was. It was very clearly something to be concerned about. They went and spoke to their supervisor about it. Their supervisor said, no problem, don't worry about it, I'll handle it. Didn't do anything. One of the kids finally told their parents what was happening to them. A parent called the hotline, and all 4 of those professionals were fired and lost their licenses and have been put on the child abuse registry for, I believe it was failure to protect children. So they haven't been charged criminally and they haven't been sued civilly, but they've lost their ability to participate in the profession that they actually obtained college degrees to do. So, and I've actually heard one of them say, I wish that I had just gone and picked up the phone and sat on hold for 10 minutes and made the phone call, because it's completely changed her life. And in the process, there were a lot of other children who were, potentially abused during the interim. So there are both criminal penalties and civil penalties for failing to report. The criminal penalties are if you willfully fail to report, it's a Class A misdemeanor. If you recklessly fail to report, say you've never been through a training, you don't know better, you don't know you're a mandated reporter, it's a Class B misdemeanor, both of which are really kind of a slap on the wrist. And you have to have a prosecutor who is willing to file charges against you, feels like they have a good enough case that they don't want to offer you a plea bargain, wants to take it to trial, and all of that. What you really need to be concerned with are the civil cases. And the best example of this, if any of you are my age or older and you remember the O.J. Simpson trial, the first one, the murder trial from the early 90s, and I'm not saying he did or didn't murder anyone. I don't know. I wasn't there. But he was found not guilty in criminal court because all 12 jurors didn't agree beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered anyone. He was held civilly liable in civil court for the exact same thing because in civil court it's preponderance of the evidence, which means you could be 51% convinced someone did something and 49% convinced that they didn't, and that would be preponderance of the evidence. And all the jurors don't have to agree. You don't have to have a prosecutor involved. You just have to get an attorney who's willing to take some money to file a case. So you need to be concerned with the civil implications. You can lose your house or your car, your wages can be garnished, things like that. So I'm a careful person anyway, but I tend to tell people it's better to err on the side of caution and report if you feel that you have reasonable cause to make a report. Okay. The last thing that I want to tell you before you have an opportunity to ask questions would be that there is an additional training for mandated reporters that actually does include indicators of maltreatment, and I would strongly recommend that you go to that training when you have time, and we worked very hard on it for over a couple of years. It's a wonderful resource for you to have. You create an account, log in, and you have access to really all of the child abuse information that you could possibly need for the state of Arkansas. You have access to a lot of resources. Even if you don't take the training, you have access to some flow charts that let you know as an investigation goes, what are the possibilities of what could happen, how is it determined if a call is accepted at the hotline, once an allegation is substantiated, what then happens, and it's all Arkansas specific. So it's a very, very good resource, so you might want to consider taking a look at that. And then also, if you have any questions for me after today, you have my phone number and also my email address. Please notice that my email address is William's son, Sherry J. There's a very nice lady who works at UAMS whose name is Sherry J. Williams, and she gets really freaked out when she gets a lot of emails about child abuse. It happens a lot, apparently. Okay, so if you have any questions, do *6 to unmute your telephone. And then I have another question that's just popped up on the screen. What are Sherry's thoughts on how to address parents who get angry when they find out your report, especially if they deny or disagree with your report? I think most counselors struggle with this. That's a great question. I used to be a juvenile probation officer, and I realize that's not nearly obviously what your job is, but I know that I, as well as you, had to develop a rapport with kids and earn their trust and develop somewhat of a rapport with their parents in order to really be able to be proactive and help those at-risk kids. And so it's very difficult if they figure out you're the one who called. The fact is, after you make a call to the hotline, they're entitled to, if they go pay, I think, $10, a copy of the report that will show everyone who was interviewed. So your name can pop up as someone who was interviewed. Now, who actually made the call is supposed to be redacted out of the report. I'm not sure who it is who's in charge of redacting it. I'm not going to say it never happens, that somebody doesn't understand what they're supposed to redact all identifying information, not just your name. So if it's came into my office at, and then you give the address of your office, that should all be redacted out. You are not required by law to tell the parents that you called the hotline. I think something I've had a couple of counselors tell me that when they have the initial contact with the kids and with the parents, and I know a couple of probation officers who have actually started doing this too, when they're doing intake, they make it very clear that by law they're required to report any suspicions of abuse or allegations of abuse, whether they have evidence to support it or not, that it's just part of their job that it has to be reported. And so at that point, if something does come out, even if they get upset, they're not completely blindsided by it. Although, having dealt with parents who are on the other end of it, they're not always going to be rational, and obviously it can sometimes be quite scary. I would say, as far as directly how to deal with it, would be to just remind them that it's one of your professional duties, and that ethically that you have to make a report if you have any concern, and hope that they will deal with it, better when they cool off a little. Does anyone have any other questions for me? Complete silence. Is everyone still awake? Okay, well, you all have my contact information if you think of any questions later, and if you want, you can just go ahead and email those to me. So if I don't have the answer, I can forward it on to someone to get the answer from them. And before I hand it back over to Chad, I want to thank you all very much for the work that you do with kids. I have adopted recently 3 children from DHS, and they are benefiting greatly from TSCBT, and so I just want you to know that you're very much appreciated for the work you do. Chad? Okay,
thank you, Sherry, and just I think you all can see below there, our next webinar is going to be on August 16th, and we're talking about the trauma narrative as it relates to TSCBT. So hope everyone has a great weekend, and I will email this PowerPoint later this afternoon. So please let me know if you have any other questions. Take care.